Friendship Focus is brought to you in part by Review Systems Incorporated, experts in care coordination services for auto and work injuries. Welcome, I'm Barbara Marcum, the Director of Senior Resources for the City of Westland. With me today, I have two interesting fellows. We actually had a meeting regarding this show. We have Stephen Kish and Jim Vermeulen from Vermeulen-Sajewski Funeral Home. Used to be just Vermeulen, now it's Vermeulen-Sajewski, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I asked him here today because I am very curious about the history of funerals, and I'm also very interested in talking about some of the issues and how funerals developed over the years. So let's talk a little bit, Steve, first, and about the Civil War and how it contributed to the evolution of funeral homes, because things before that were very different. What was the changing point?
The major point of funeral service in the Civil War was the actual embalming of the deceased soldiers, the repatriation, or being able to send them back to their home state. Obviously, in a time such as that, when a death occurred, most of the time the fatalities were buried immediately on the spot. Supplies were extremely short-lived in the Civil War, hence they were taking uniforms, they were taking weapons. There was really no form of identification. Most of the military units would actually go ahead and bury their deceased comrades immediately after the battle. Hopefully they would at least put what they referred to as a headboard or a type of marker on the grave, indicating a name and a rank. Soldiers were buried generally at the site where the battle took place. Dependent upon rank of the deceased individual, if it was an officer or if it was a family of well-to-do status, then those soldiers were repatriated or taken back home. Obviously, we had no refrigeration at that time. Embalming at the time consisted of placement of ice on an individual. As the Civil War started, there was a physician who went ahead and actually enhanced the embalming process, very similar to what we're using in life today. It's involving an arterial application of chemicals through the vascular system, enabling the deceased to be transported back home via the wagon or a locomotive steam train.
Yeah, they didn't have airplanes those days, so you think if somebody was from Maine or Vermont in a battle down further in Tennessee or Kentucky, that would be a considerable trip home.
Definitely was. Would have been a very long wagon ride, or if they were fortunate and the rails were running, placement on a train.
Wow. Well, what exactly now do they do embalming, Jim? Is it the same type? How has that evolved from the early embalming stages to now?
Well, it would be similar in that chemicals are distributed through the body through the arterial system. Really not a lot different than when you've had an IV. Back in the olden days, the fluids would be hanging in a bottle like an IV bottle. IV intravenous, medicines spread throughout your body through a vein. When you're embalming a body, a deceased body, it goes to the arteries. But it's chemicals that are distributed through the arterial system, so it preserves the body, it disinfects the body, and it restores the body to a more natural texture and appearance. So the person, if they had bruising, that can be lessened or diminished. If a body, a deceased person, the body becomes very flaccid. With the embalming, restores a more natural texture, and certainly it would disinfect the body so that to have an open casket viewing for a day or a week or longer, or to hold the body for a couple weeks, say families out of the country or they can't travel or someone's sick, we can have a body stay at the funeral home for a week or two, really with no problem. We've had it, up to a month. So it allows people more flexibility that they can wait and have a funeral when the time would be right, rather than being forced to die on Thursday, have a funeral on Friday.
Plus, we have refrigeration on top of that
Exactly,
now that we
yes.
didn't have then.
Exactly.
And I didn't actually think about that I thought about preserving the body, but disease would be, another reason to embalm. So I never even thought about that, but that would, have a reason to do that also.
Sure.
Okay, now we do have air travel, and we can get somebody, a deceased person, back home within a couple of hours, even if it's cross country. So sometimes if somebody absolutely does not want to be embalmed, do they have to be embalmed?
In Michigan, and the laws about funerals are set by each state. So this could vary across the country. But in Michigan, if a body is going to be buried or cremated within 48 hours, the law does not require the body to be embalmed. If the body is going to be transferred across state lines, it needs to be embalmed, or if it's not going to be buried or cremated within 48 hours. So most of the time, more than 50%. A majority of the time, the body is not buried or cremated that quickly, so embalming would be required. The other time, which is the more common situation, where people want the body embalmed because they want a viewing.
Yeah.
They want to see grandma, and they want to have grandma look nice, get her hair done, put a little pink lipstick on her, put her favorite outfit on, and the embalming allows all that to happen without any odors and the body looking very natural.
It also stops decomposition, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, if somebody didn't want to be embalmed, the family could still have an ID. We could still dress the body. It just would need to be done quickly, and the results are going to be very much dependent on what the condition of the body was when they died. So it might be just fine. They might look okay. On the other hand, if there were issues when the person died, they may not look so nice. Yeah. So generally, if people are going to have a viewing of more than just one or two people, we would certainly recommend the body be prepared, be embalmed, and look just as nice as possible.
Well, let's talk a little bit about early times, because I remember my grandmother telling me when her mother died that she was in the parlor, and they were in Pennsylvania, and neighbors came over, and there she was in the living room, and everybody came in. Let's talk about that practice a little bit. What was with the parlor then? And did they embalm people at that time, at the turn of the century? I imagine that's probably when things changed a little bit.
Yes, it certainly was a slow transition, because we didn't have funeral homes 150 years ago. They probably started popping up maybe about 100 years ago. But I believe the history is that used to be most people lived on farms, so you did things yourself.
They did.
So you might have had a home funeral. You might have had somebody build a box, or the cabinet maker build a box, put ice around the body, put them in the front room, in the parlor, in the house. And then as embalming started coming along, then you started having the cabinet maker might have bought a fancy wagon to carry the casket to the cemetery. And then actual funeral homes came up, who not only would provide the caskets, but the fancy wagon, or now hearse. And then as the time went by, some of them learned how to embalm, so they could prepare the body rather than just putting the body on ice. And then people got sick of people coming to their home and tramping around their house, or people might not have had a house with a big parlor, and it just wasn't convenient to have the viewing at the home. So then enterprising funeral director would let them come to his house. So typically the funeral home of 80 or 100 years ago would have been a two-story home. Yeah. Funeral director lived upstairs. The bottom floor, the main floor, was the part of the house that used as the funeral home. Now, today, that has transitioned where buildings are built specifically to be funeral homes, where they're all on one level, hopefully no stairs, maybe bigger rooms, bigger hallways, so they could handle a big crowd if you had that.
Well, it's interesting because, it seems like it's very personal when somebody was in your home and neighbors would come in, but you're right. I mean, I don't even know if they had hours where people would come and visit. I mean, I'm thinking if somebody passes away, you probably had people coming at all hours of the day. And then I can't, especially, I mean, you look at rural communities, and Glenshaw was where they lived, and probably hundreds of people knew them. In rural towns and neighborhoods, everybody knew you, so I imagine everybody came to your home. So it would have been, but at the same time, where it might have been inconvenient, it was very personal, and I know that, that has changed a little bit since then. But you said something about wagons and about they actually had cemeteries, but did somebody, that's how they hauled the box or whatever by a wagon? There were no hearses then, that's how they got to the cemetery then?
Well, depending what time frame we're talking about, but before they had cars, they certainly didn't have hearses.
No.
And when people lived on a farm, they often have a little private family cemetery right on the family farm.
We did in Pennsylvania.
So there you probably used a farm wagon and went from the parlor of the house to the cemetery, which might have been 100 yards. Then when people started having churches would often build a little cemetery next to the church. So again, getting the casketed body to the church, you'd probably use a wagon. But then from the church to the cemetery, you might have just carried it, because again, it might have been 50 yards or less right to the graveyard right next to the cemetery. Now, as people have moved away and moved in big cities, many times the body is transported many miles. So obviously, now that we have cars, we have special vehicles, hearses to use instead of the wagon that would have been used a long time ago.
Well, it's interesting because you look throughout history, and cremation wasn't always a choice that, like during the plague, of course, they burned, a lot of people at one time for obviously disease reasons. They didn't know how it was spread, and then some cultures put elderly people on an ice float and out to sea, and the Vikings sent them out on a burning raft. And so a lot of things, there are different cultural things that different parts of the world did, but it seems like, okay, in the United States, we had a lot of people from a lot of different cultures who were here, and still our funeral and the way it began and the way it continued is basically the same throughout the country. Stephen, is it not?
It most definitely is. The major differences in funeral practices amount to different ethnic groups and religious cultures.
And I don't know this, I haven't thought about this, but then I assume then there are funeral homes that do cater to specific cultures or religions.
Goodness, it's interesting that you mention that, because for the longest time, when the funeral home came into existence shortly after World War II, the funeral homes seemed to be designated as either being a Catholic funeral home or a Protestant funeral home. Today, obviously, those barriers have come down, but there still are certain ethnic groups that cater to their particular ethnic beliefs and slightly to some of their religious beliefs.
Does religion have anything to do with how a body is taken care of after death?
There are certain religious groups today that still prohibit cremation. The Eastern Orthodox religion, the Orthodox Jews, they will have a tendency to say that cremation is forbidden. Most of the other religious groups have accepted cremation as a form of disposition in addition to burial.
Well, okay, so as far as embalming, does that have any religious or cultural lines, or?
If we are looking at the certain religious beliefs that insist burial take place the same day or within 24 hours from the time of death, in many of those religious circumstances, embalming is not required.
All right, now that you mentioned this, I'm going to ask you a question. When you said within 24 hours, I read a lot of things through the years about the graveyard shift and the people being buried and them finding claw marks on the casket. So the graveyard shift would be somebody and they'd run a thing. So if somebody woke up, they'd ring a bell. Are any of those things true?
This is what I have understood. I have heard of certain instances of disinterring bodies finding interiors of caskets that appear to be scraped by fingernails or someone in distress.
You would really smother pretty soon after waking up. There's not a lot of air.
There's not a lot of air inside of a casket. No, I
No.
wouldn't imagine there is. So
Right.
yeah, I would imagine that's probably an old wives' tale. I don't want to use the term urban legend.
Right,
but
right.
probably an old wives' tale.
Right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about funeral homes changing from the parlor. How are they designed now as a funeral home? What things do you think about when you think about not the funeral director living upstairs? I had a girlfriend who grew up in a funeral home, was kind of one of those little adventurous, not easily reined in children, and she said she would throw Lincoln logs down on the people during the funeral from the vents from the upstairs home, because Dad was down there in the funeral home, and she was up there causing all kinds of mischief. But anyway, so when obviously the people lived upstairs and that was good, but now when a funeral home is designed, what do they think of conceptually? What do you want a funeral home to be?
I think the first thing that would have to go into consideration with the funeral home would be adequate parking. That was a major determining factor as far as taking the funerals out of the home. If we had someone who was well known in their community and they had hundreds of people come to their home for the visitation or the funeral service, where did they park? Obviously, they must have parked in the neighbors' yards, in front of the neighbors' homes,
Right.
things such as that. My first thing that I would consider if I was going to build or design a funeral home today is I would look at parking immediately.
Yeah, that would be a huge, not a good thing, having your whole neighborhood taken up and walking for a mile to get to the house. Okay, so the graveyards, it's interesting because in Pittsburgh, my family had a land grant from the King of England, and they had their own little cemetery up on the hill. And so, but then also, the early churches had small graveyards, and when I, the Irish Hills, my folks go to a little church, and I walked back through the cemetery, and they, some of those gravestones go way, way, way back. So they must have had either, if they had land, they had a farm, they probably had a graveyard, and then for those people who lived in a small city or town, they probably had a church graveyard, I would assume.
And then as our towns became larger, it became the practice to go ahead and establish the cemeteries on the outskirts of the town. Obviously, I think a major reason for that was the public health scenario. You mentioned earlier plagues, illnesses, things such as that. Obviously, from a public health point of view, they wanted the deceased to be buried away from the general community. As a community is growing, I think the last thing you want to do is designate an area of prime real estate as a cemetery. Hence, cemeteries were moved to the outskirts of town. That is kind of where the whole concept of the wagon funeral hearse came into play also, because of the sheer distance from the funeral home, the church, to the outskirts of town. The pallbearers could not carry the body to the cemetery as they might with a church cemetery. Hence, they had a wagon. In the beginning, actually, it came to whoever had the nicest wagon in the community would designate that for use to take the deceased to the cemetery. As we became a little more modernized as far as automobiles, then that is when the funeral coach or hearse, as we know it today, kind of came into play.
Well, then the same thing would go for what they called a casket. Originally, maybe it was a box, but there were no casket companies. I mean, we have things, literally, you look at some of the caskets today and think about them starting out as a box. So did they keep boxes around, or did they make boxes up? Like the carpenter, or is that how they did that?
Actually, the predecessor to the funeral director as we know it today was that of the cabinet maker in the town or the woodworker. They would physically construct the casket at the time of death. They would then sell the casket to the family, or perhaps the undertaker at the time would have access to the casket. He would get it for the family for the burial.
Jim, what the history of undertakers? how did that begin? Because I'm thinking, like in the war, I mean, you just have somebody who took charge of that after it happened. It seems like there would have to be some coordination, right, with a burial. And so, like families, of course, if they had a church affiliation, they had a minister, but would they just call the cabinet maker out of the blue and say, we had a death, can you make us something? Did they keep those in a warehouse?
It probably varied from every town. You know, small towns were probably a little less organized. Bigger towns, I believe that the enterprising cabinet maker or furniture store got himself a nice wagon so he could sell you what they probably called a coffin then. And really the difference is caskets are more rectangular, coffins are narrow at the top, wider at the shoulders, tapering toward the feet.
I have seen that.
Yeah, when
yes.
you've seen that, maybe you're talking like an old Western burial, that was often, because you can use a little less wood that way when you only make it wide at the shoulders and narrow at the feet. Now we make caskets that are rectangular, so they kind of hopefully fit everybody. But so the enterprising furniture store would give himself a nice wagon, and then eventually, as embalming became common, then maybe they started embalming, and then rather than having the body laid out at the parlor, you could have the body laid out at the funeral home. But I'm sure that all vary depending on every little town. But yes, there is a lot of coordination, especially today, because funerals are a bit more complicated than they were then. Now we have videos and we have pictures and we have printing and register books.
Modern technology.
And musician and soloist, yes. And so there are a lot of details. Funerals 100 years ago, 80 years ago were probably a bit simpler.
Yeah, and I look too and I think, okay, I'm looking at the box and the shape of the box from what we have now, and satin lining and pillows and the whole thing. I mean, going from a wooden box to what we have today, that is quite the change.
You know, some caskets and funerals can be elaborate and some can be very simple. So it really just depends on what people want.
Well, you know what? It's all about what people want, because I know that you and people who are, you know, it's when my mom passed away, I don't know what we would have done without a great funeral director. And, you know, that is a time where people are really grieving, and it's really nice to have somebody who cares about what you want and make sure that you get what you want.
Yeah, it's very important, and if you happen to know the funeral director and have been served by them before, it really makes it better for everybody, because the funeral director has an idea what you want, because you might have done a funeral or two before them, and for the family to have been through it and can have trust in this person, can communicate easily and explain just exactly what they want. That's what really it's best, is when people are able to explain what they want, or just ask the questions. Hey, how are the 3 different ways we can do this? And we're never in a situation where we want to tell people what to do. We certainly want to explain the options,
Yes, the
pros and
options.
cons, difference in costs, advantages, disadvantages, because everybody is served best when we're all done with the funeral process, that everybody feels good about what happened.
Exactly. Well, let's thank you for talking a little bit about the history, because I've always been very curious about how things have evolved in this country from, like you said, World War II and the Civil War, and how embalming came into be. And I've always been fascinated and had those questions. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise today about the history of funerals. Stephen and Jim, thanks for being our guest today.
Thank you for having us here, Barbara.
Thank you.
Enjoyed
and
it.
Thank you, friends in the viewing audience, for being with us today. Friendship Focus was brought to you in part by Review Systems Incorporated, experts in care coordination services for auto and work injuries.